Welcome, dear listeners, to the Carolina Haynes podcast, brought to you by Wreak Havoc Productions and A Darker World. I'm your host, Dan Sellers. Today we bring you something a little different. The story I'm about to tell you isn't about ghosts or folklore or anything supernatural, but that doesn't make what you're about to hear any less horrific. Germany, in the early 1930s, before the war, before the concentration camps, even before Hitler was elected chancellor in 1934. The Nazi Party introduced a eugenics program. Eugenics is the science of improving a race or social class by mating only with individuals that have attributes that are considered the most desirable. The Nazi eugenics program was designed to sterilize Lebens unwertes, life unworthy of life, so that they wouldn't breed more children with their same so-called defects. The program targeted prisoners, degenerates, and people with cognitive or physical disabilities. Some of the conditions that the Nazi Party had described as disabilities included epilepsy, schizophrenia, cerebral palsy, manic depression, muscular dystrophy, blindness, homosexuality, insanity, or anyone who was deemed feeble-minded. The Nazi eugenics program would eventually be expanded to include euthanasia and ultimately evolve into state-sanctioned genocide. But eugenics wasn't a German invention. It was, well, in the words of Hitler himself, there is one state in which at least the weak beginnings toward a better conception are noticeable. Of course, it is not our model German Republic, but the United States. Sir Francis Galton was a statistician, socialist, psychologist, anthropologist, inventor, tropical explorer, geographer, meteorologist, and his cousin was Charles Darwin. Galton used his prestigious knowledge to bestow the world with the beauty map of Great Britain, a list ranking British cities by the attractiveness of their women. If you are curious, London ranked first, while Aberdeen came in at the bottom of the list. In 1880, hot on the heels of the groundbreaking scientific breakthrough, Galton was the first to present the concepts of eugenics to the world. He proudly promoted the forcible sterilization of the poor, disabled, and deviant. The movement was embraced by over a dozen countries, including the United States. In 1896, Connecticut was the first state to enact a law prohibiting anyone who was epileptic, imbecile, or feeble-minded from marrying. The majority of the states quickly followed suit. In 1906, Indiana became the first state to pass sterilization legislation. Again, almost every other state soon had their own version of the eugenics law, including California, which sterilized more people than the rest of the nation combined. It was the eugenics director from California who assisted the Nazis in drafting their own program. Officially, only 32 states passed sterilization legislation, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen. Take Pennsylvania, for instance. Despite having no eugenics laws, they forcibly sterilized 270 people. The Keystone State also performed the first eugenics-motivated castration in the United States in 1889. In reality, every state in the Union has performed forced sterilization at some point in its history. Polls conducted in 1937 showed that 2/3 of all Americans supported sterilization of mentally disabled and of criminals. Of course, the general public wasn't always presented with all the facts. For example, sterilization was suggested by social workers as an effective form of birth control. Thousands of women voluntarily opted for the procedure, but they were never told that it was permanent. Many of them later tried to have the operation reversed, only to find out that it was impossible. The laws were presented to the public as providing benefits to both the individual citizen and the reduce to the economic cost to society from unwanted childbirths. North Carolina first introduced a eugenics bill in 1919, but it didn't fully go into effect until 1933. Many of the sterilizations performed were done by consulting individuals by their own family doctors, so the total number of operations is truly unknown. It's estimated to be between 7,000 and 10,000. This ranked North Carolina as the third highest number of sterilizations in the country. Mecklenburg County was the most enthusiastic county to take up the eugenics pitchfork. County Welfare Director Wallace Carrault fought to expand the parameters to include people suffering from blindness, deafness, heart disease, and cancer, arguing that 1. These parents are more likely to produce defective children, and 2. A healthy child born to such a couple would be, quote, doomed to an undesirable environment, end quote. He also included those living beneath the poverty line in order to, quote, prevent these conditions which are so costly to society, end quote. The number of sterilizations increased dramatically in the 1950s and through the 60s. It was about that time that the program expanded its scope. The way the law was written did not limit it to just convicted felons or the institutionalized disabled. It also had the authority to sterilize any North Carolina citizen, provided that the individual's next of kin file the proper paperwork. Of course, there was a 5-person review board, but as long as the majority of the North Carolina Eugenics Board approved, then sterilization could be performed on anyone in North Carolina, not just those in institutions. People, mostly women, also volunteered to be sterilized, as we said before. Many of these women were unwed mothers, which in the 1950s and 60s was quite scandalous. Social workers would convince these women, some as young as 13 years old, that sterilization was in their best interest. And when that didn't work, they threatened to suspend their welfare benefits if they did not volunteer for the procedure. Complicating things further was a group called the Human Betterment League. Sounds like some kind of Soylent Green propaganda committee, doesn't it? And it was. The propaganda part, anyway. The Winston-Salem-based organization spread its message about the positive aspects of eugenics throughout the state. Founded in 1947 by the hosiery mogul James G. Haynes and backed by several prominent area businessmen, the foundation had enough resources to influence public opinion. For over 40 years, they peppered the state with almost 1 million eugenics flyers entitled, "You Wouldn't Expect." The flyers were designed to scare the public by promoting propaganda. The Human Betterment League also had enough political power to influence the media. Several newspaper articles ran praising the benefits of eugenics and claiming that people with disabilities would breed like rabbits and contaminate the healthy human stock. Now, I guess an idea like eugenics may not seem that surprising, considering that we also used to lock away people inflicted with incurable diseases like tuberculosis, in sanitariums to die the slow, grueling death of ennui. But eugenics survived well past the 1930s. Forcible sterilizations were performed for decades in North Carolina. Officially, the North Carolina Eugenics Board was dissolved in 1977 when the laws enabling forced sterilization were repealed. Now, if that math doesn't make sense to you, then you're right. The Human Betterment League continued to distribute their flyers 10 years after eugenics officially ended in North Carolina. And why is that? Because sterilizations continued in North Carolina, but they were no longer overseen by the North Carolina Eugenics Board. In 2002, North Carolina became one of the first states to denounce eugenics and offer a public apology for those who had been affected. Again, this date is ironic, since involuntary sterilizations continued for another several months. North Carolina was the first state to earmark a fund offering $50,000 in compensation to anyone who had been sterilized without their consent. Unfortunately, very few of the North Carolina Eugenics Board victims that are still alive will qualify for the payout. California was still performing forced sterilizations as late as 2013. To learn more about the North Carolina Eugenics Board, check out ncpedia.org. You can also read articles on npr.org, salon.com, and the Wikipedia pages for eugenics in the United States, Nazi eugenics, and the Eugenics Board of North Carolina. This episode was researched and written by Jeff Cochran and was produced by me, Dan Sellers. You can find everything that Jeff's up to at his company at adarkerworld.com. And you can keep up with everything Wreak Havoc Productions is doing at wreakhavocproductions.com. Feel free to email me with any questions or concerns you might have, wreakhavocproductions@gmail.com. You can find Carolina Haints on iTunes, Google Play, and YouTube. Please subscribe and leave us a review, and share it with your friends. And while you're at it, please consider contributing to our endeavors on Patreon at patreon.com/wreakhavoc. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a new episode. Tune in then to hear more about the things that go bump in the night.